You're listening to the Roofr Report. Tune in for exclusive interviews with roofing experts and insights from leaders who walk the walk. Grow with Roofr, and your host, Pete McKendrick.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Roofr Podcast. I am your host, Pete McKendrick. And a little while back, we made a transition in the style of our podcast a little bit, where we started to move away from talking about tech and talking about all the things around, all the tools needed to run your business. And we really started to focus on the core of running the business, right? And the things that you need to really focus on to make yourself successful and make your business successful and to build a team. And that leads right into our topic today and our guest, Corey Combs. Really excited to have you on, Corey. Corey is the owner of SouthShore. I'll let him do a quick introduction of himself here and then dive into Corey's story a little bit and talk about building that team culture, right? That's really our topic for today. And I think it's one that's become very important in the industry, but also just in general with anyone running a business. Corey, excited to have you. Glad you could come on.
Yeah, thanks. And I was just thinking about it this morning. Actually, you and I met years ago, right? And so it's been interesting how things have changed. And I'm happy that you're with Roofr. I love the product and that kept this relationship throughout the years.
It's funny. Really cool. It's funny to me. I wasn't sure if you remembered, but yeah, I was actually the sales rep that sold Corey on, was that your first CRM?
Yeah. First CRM.
Yeah. That's funny. And that was, now probably what, five years ago?
Yeah, 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah. So very cool. It's funny that you remember that. Yeah, it's funny. I was actually thinking the same thing this morning. I was like, man, Corey and I have known each other for a while.
Yeah, and that dovetails a little bit into me and my company story. That I was just starting my own company. I was working for another large remodeling company. And I spent like 3 years planning the opening of my company. In Florida, you have to have licensing and all of that stuff. I spent time studying, getting my licensing. I have my general contractor's license in Florida, and then I also have my roofing license in Florida. And during that time, I really focused on reading books, figuring out how I wanted my company to be structured, and putting benchmarks in place to really give me a structure to help grow. Because when you start out, you're by yourself, basically, right? It was just me and an installation crew. And that was close to 5 years ago. And here we are now.
Nice. Yeah. Give us a little background on you. How did you get into roofing? Did you come from a contractor background? Did you grow up in it? What's your story?
Yeah, my first job at the ripe old age of 12 was cleaning up a construction sites for a friend of my mom's who owned a framing company here in Tampa. And I come from a blue collar family. My dad worked on the railroad for his entire career. And so part of that was being involved in construction. We always did all of the projects around the house. So he kind of taught me some of the stuff about construction. And so I was always in construction. And growing up, I was not a great kid, man. I got addicted to drugs, and construction was like the natural place that we went. And my first roofing job was in 1994. I worked on a tear-off crew, and the company had an interesting structure because in Florida, new construction was huge. It was exploding. And they had a tear-off crew for re-roofs, and then they had a dry-in crew for new construction. So I worked on that crew. So we're either tearing off and drying in, or we were just drying in. So I learned, when I was the low guy, I learned how to work a tear-off shovel real well and clean up and all that stuff. And then I moved into shingling, and I worked at that company for close to 8 years and learned how to shingle, and it made good money. But then my family started to buy properties and do flips and buy rentals and all that stuff. And I was the construction guy, even though I didn't know anything but roofing. They brought me on, and I kind of did all the rental prep and painting and patching, all that stuff. And yeah, I just kind of learned hands-on. And really how I learned was making a lot of mistakes and doing things wrong. Yeah. And I had some good teachers throughout the years, but really how I learned was just messing stuff up, man, and then trying to figure out how to fix it.
I did some contractor work for years, and it was same thing. Like a lot of the best lessons I learned there were things that I made and said, oh, this ain't going to work. I just realized that I had epically failed and then figured out how to fix it from there. Yeah. So I totally get that. So you finally decide to go into roofing, right? You start your own roofing company. Tell us some of the challenges that you faced, even maybe before you even really got the company launched and started doing stuff. Like you said, 3 years of planning. There's a lot that goes into it, right? And I think a lot of people drastically underestimate what it takes to start a business, just to get a business off the ground, and then ultimately to run. Speak a little bit to like what you found as some of the biggest challenges with that.
Yeah. One of the things that I feel really fortunate about is 2008, we had that epic crash. Construction was just non-existent. Flipping houses was non-existent. And I was really left without a job, right? And we pretty much lost everything. We were pretty invested in real estate. I was just starting to sober up at the time as I was going through that whole transition and situation. And it was really difficult. And I met a guy who, I actually met him in the rooms at AA, which was really fortuitous. And what he did was he sold marketing packages to health clubs. And so he traveled all over the country and taught health clubs how to market their business and how to sell. And so that was my first introduction into learning how to sell and how to do marketing and all of that stuff. And I worked with him for several years. I opened a business with him. And I learned a lot on the business operations, a lot of how to sell, like really the fundamentals of sales he taught me. And I was their number one sales guy by a lot, like every year over year. And it gave me the confidence to open up a business with him. We fumbled through that. We did pretty well. The business is still in existence. He and I kind of had a falling out. And what happened was I got the confidence in understanding how to sell. And so when the market started to recover, I went to work for a larger remodeling company at that time. This was 15, 16 years ago. They were doing $12 million, which was huge at the time, right? I learned how to sell remodeling and I learned how to structure my pitches and all of that stuff to be successful selling high end. And we were the most expensive by far. I mean, we always walked in knowing we were going to be the most expensive. And so I learned a lot on how to sell. I got a lot of training. And what that company did was they really focused on being good at the fundamentals in terms of construction, understanding remodeling, like knowing the core competencies of the company, which was how to do remodeling, right? And so we went to training all the time on that stuff, and I got a lot of good experience there. So when I was still working for them when I decided to open my own company, and I was taking some of the stuff that they had taught me. I learned how the business side of it worked. And I also learned some of the stuff that they did absolutely terribly. Just right. They were a good company. They were a successful company, but they did a lot of things really terribly. So sort of took that and I mapped out everything that worked for me. And then I mapped out everything that didn't work to make sure that I didn't make those mistakes. I'm just going to tell you, I still made some of those mistakes running my own company. But it was an easier turnaround because I really had the experience in the industry and I really had the experience in sales and marketing and remodeling and in all of that different stuff. It really shortened my learning curve big time. It was just the planning, man. I think the planning made all the difference in the world. I really do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I did a podcast a while back with Dave Sullivan. I don't know if you know him. He has his own podcast that he does, and he was a contractor for years. And he really focuses on the business plan aspect of it. Like just because you're starting a roofing company and not some company in another industry, the business plan still has to be done. It's still a very important part of things like what we talked about at the beginning of this before we even started the podcast of, figuring out what your core values are, figuring out what your mission statement is. What do you want to accomplish? Like all of these things, laying those out in the beginning rather than just kind of winging it and then trying to figure them out later. Like you said, it's difficult. It's difficult sometimes in the very beginning to write those things out and say like, this is what ultimately I want my company to be.
Yeah.
And it's going to evolve. It's going to change. But it's a very interesting podcast with Dave and talking about laying that groundwork and how important that planning time is to the success of your business. And I think it's a piece that gets drastically overlooked because, like you said, it's difficult, right? It's very difficult to come up with that stuff.
Yeah. I think one of my biggest things was understanding that I had, or my ego, thinking that I knew everything, right? Because I've been in the industry for so long. I was very successful, and I really overlooked a lot of the things that were really important. And kind of what we're going to talk about today is team culture and how to have a good place where people want to work and all of that different stuff. I focused on like sales, right? Because I'm like, that is the lifeblood of the business. If you don't have sales, you've got no fuel for the machine, right? That's just
Right.
kind of logic, right? But I think what you don't realize is, what happens when you have something bad happen on a job, right? Do you have a plan in place? Do you have the wherewithal to take care of that stuff? Do you have the experience to take care of it? Do you have the processes in place to make sure that those things don't happen? And if they do, what's a really good way to take care of that stuff? And so those are the things that I've really had to learn while I was operating my business. I knew that I wanted to knock it out of the park on the customer service side and on the sales side, but really like filling that in when you don't have that information is hard to do. And those are the things that you're going to learn when you're operating your business. Hopefully, those are the things you're going to learn.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think everybody goes into business like that. The only way I can be successful is to just sell, right?
Yeah.
And there's so many other pieces of that puzzle that initially you don't even think about, because all you're thinking about is the bottom line, right? How am I going to put money in the account? I'm going to sell jobs. I'm just going to get out there and sell at all costs, and we're going to pound out production and go crazy here and try to get as many jobs through the funnel as we can. And there are so many of those small pieces that get overlooked until it's almost like reactive, right? Until something happens, and then you're like, oh shit, we didn't think of this, right?
Yeah.
Right. So I totally get that. I've been on some construction sites that were sketchy, right? And it's like, did we think this through? Yeah. So I totally get where you're coming from. So
Yeah.
talk about when you started out, right? You were small. It was probably just you by yourself, right? For the most part.
Yep.
And at what point did you realize like, hey, I'm going to need to add people to this? And I'm sure I think that's one of the hardest things as a business owner to do, is this get to the point where you're like, okay, I'm going to bring someone else in here to help me, and I'm going to have to trust them with some responsibility. Because when you build a business from scratch and it's your baby, like, I think it's one of the hardest things to come to grips with is letting go a little bit and allowing someone else to be part of it, right? And have some responsibility in it.
Yeah. Yeah. So my first year, and this was me doing absolutely everything except for the installs, right? So I had a crew that I worked with. So I was selling, I was doing final walkthroughs, I was doing QC on the roofing jobs, I was doing the material ordering, I was doing absolutely everything. And I did $1.5 million my first year, right? And it was really challenging. I literally worked all the time. Yeah. And when I realized I needed to bring somebody on was when things started to slip through the cracks, when I wasn't getting back to people that wanted to do business with me, and I wasn't getting back to them to bring them in and get the contract signed and all that stuff. I was like, oh crap, I've got to bring somebody in. And of course I didn't bring in an admin, right? I brought in a salesperson, right? I'm like, we need to sell more, right? That was the mindset. So I brought in a salesperson, and he brought in another guy because my marketing was starting to do so well, and we were getting referrals because we were doing a good job and all that stuff. And so I had to get so many leads that I was booked out 2-3 weeks sometimes, and people won't wait. They won't wait. Yeah. Right. So I brought in a couple sales guys, and this is a really important distinction. I don't do insurance work. I've never done insurance work. In the state of Florida, everybody thinks restoration contracts. I've always been 100% retail, with the exception of one of the sales guys I brought in. He came from a restoration background, and that's all he wanted to do. And we could have a whole other podcast about that. But yeah. So the distinction here is I do all retail. And so I brought in these couple sales guys. I trained them. I got them going, which, by the way, one of them is my sales manager now. And I have 7 sales guys. He's my sales manager, and he is a monster, selling over $2 million a year. Just a beast of a sales guy. And he's not from the roofing industry. He sold laser spine surgeries, right? And I taught him. Yeah, I taught him. I groomed him. He did what I told him to do, and just crushed it, right? So I brought the salespeople on, and then I figured out I needed to bring on an admin to do the permitting and to do all that stuff. And it just kind of grew organically. And now I've got 7 sales guys. I've got a sales manager. I've got a project manager. I've got an admin, and I've got 4 in-house crews that we keep busy and a couple sub crews. No, that's not true. I have 6 in-house crews, and then I have a sub crew that does all of our metal.
Yeah, that's crazy. Looking back on it, would you have hired differently, and would you have hired sooner maybe than waiting until it was a situation where, like you said, like you just stuff started falling through the cracks? Like, I think it's a tough call as a business owner as to like when to hire those people and who to hire. Looking back on it now, would you have tried to be more proactive potentially?
I'd love to say yes, but I don't think so.
In reality, right?
Yeah. Earlier, you were talking about the podcast you did. Part of what you talked about was the business plan, and part of a business plan is really understanding your numbers, right? Yeah. Understanding your break-even point, understanding your profitability, understanding all that stuff. And let's be honest, we're construction guys. We're not finance guys. We're not business guys. So we have to learn that stuff. And just now in where we are, have I really started to understand the absolute essential nature of knowing your numbers at a granular level. And part of that is really understanding what your net profit is every month, understanding what your overhead is every month, and being able to take that information and say, okay, I can afford to hire somebody here, right? I didn't have that in place. So I did, but not at a granular level. So I wouldn't have been able to look at, hey, I have some money here to hire somebody. I'm a hard lesson kind of guy, man. I got to feel the pain before I do something different. I'd like to think that, yes, knowing better, I'd do something different, but I'm not sure that would be the case.
Yeah, it's funny that you touched on that. Be like understanding your finances at a granular level. When I was on the CRM side, it was amazing to me when I first started there. We would get these guys on and we would talk to them about their process, and you would get down to the invoicing and collecting part of the conversation. And you would say to them, what's your profit and loss statement look like? Like, how are you guys tracking net profit? What kind of net profit are you guys getting on jobs? And the answers blew my mind. You know what I mean? Like collect a check and then I pay for my materials and I pay my crew, and whatever's left over is my profit. And I said, well, you don't know your profit before you start. Like, what if you just did this whole job and you operated at a loss? And they're like, right. It happens sometimes. But it's like, wow. Like, I realized how, like you said, I think it's a lesson that when we come from a construction background, we don't think of these things, right? Like, we don't think like, oh, I need to know up front whether this job's going to be profitable. We're just like, hey, I won that job. Let's go do it. Right. And then come to find out we made nothing on it. Right? Yeah. It always blew my mind with that. Like, I distinctly remember this conversation. These 2 young guys started a roofing company. They were in like Colorado or something like that. I'm talking young, like they sounded like they were teenagers on the phone. And this guy I said to him, how do you invoice the customer? And he just like, when the conversation just went dead. And I said, how do you tell the customer what they owe you? And he said, when I come down off the roof, when I'm done, I knock on the front door and I tell them how much it is and they write me a check. I said, so you don't even give them an invoice or anything? And he's like, no, I just tell them how much the repair or the re-roof cost. And I was like, wow, like I was floored at like how far some of these guys needed to come. And I think a lot of that has to do with like you said, just kind of a lack of preparation up front. And then them realizing as they get into it, like, oops, we didn't even think of how we're going to write an invoice here, right? Yeah. Like we're just literally handing somebody a number on a napkin, right? So it's crazy to me that it really blew me away, like how much was missing from a business standpoint for these guys, right? And a lot of it is just a lack of knowledge on their point, and a lot of it is just a lack of education, right? Like nobody's really saying to these guys, like, these are the things that you really need to do if you want this business to be successful. But it really was an eye-opener for me.
Yeah, and I'll touch on this. I'm not going to go too far in the weeds with this, but I think that's one of the biggest issues that I have. One of those sales guys that came to work for me, he was in the restoration business, and their model is, okay, we're going to do the roof for whatever the proceeds are from the insurance company, right? And what that is, what you can get from the insurance company, they don't understand how to actually estimate the job. and what actually goes into the job. And so he would always say to me, because the way that we estimate out, we have every single thing that you need to build that roof in the estimate, so that like when we're done with the job, if we were short of a roof boot, we'll know it, and we'll know that $17 or whatever we were deficient on that, right? So we have our estimating down to a granular level. And the estimating at a per square, which a lot of people do, is the trap that they get into, because sometimes you have a complexity or you have some things that need to go on the roof that nobody really thinks about because they haven't dissected that to actually do the estimate. So that's how I teach my guys how to estimate, like what is actually needed to go on the roof. And you're gonna actually build that roof with your estimate so that you know exactly what goes into it, right? And then we're gonna look at the profit margin on that. And we're going to look at, okay, are we going to make money on this job or are we not, if everything goes according to plan, right? And so we really get to the granular level. And I teach my guys how to do that because they need to know, look, their paycheck is dependent on that, right? If the job's profitable or not. So it would be a disservice for me to not teach them how to do that, so that they are aware and they know how to actually do that. And when we do a post-mortem on the job and say, hey, this wasn't profitable, we can go back and we can pinpoint exactly what happened and show them where they made the mistake, right?
Yeah, it's a great point, because I know one of the things that when we would talk about the financials on the CRM side, we would specifically talk about tracking costs of a job, right? And being able to granularly see what the cost was. And I would say to guys, like, how do you even know if your sales guy is estimating that job correctly up front if you're not tracking your costs on the back end and you can compare the numbers, right? At the end of the day, I think it's more standardized now because a lot more guys are using tech and it makes life a little easier. But in the beginning, there's a lot of subjective estimating, right? Like you and I could go out, look at a roof and estimate it completely differently, like hundreds of dollars different potentially. How do we know that guy is accurately estimating that roof? And I think it's a great point. Like you're using it as an education tool to say to your guys, like, hey, we missed by this much of what we should have profited on this job. And because we're granular, this is why, right? And so now they've learned. So next time we don't make that mistake, as opposed to just going back to them and being like, what the hell? Like we thought we were going to make money off this job and we didn't, right? And not really having an answer as to why. It speaks to why that's so important.
Yeah. And I'll go even a little bit further. I see on these roofing groups all the time, you have people, oh, I need a roofing crew. I need a roofing crew. I need a roofing crew. And I know it's because they haven't been profitable on their jobs. They don't know why. They blame the installers, or the installers are throwing away material, or whatever it is, right? And they're constantly going through crews. And that's another thing that I do differently in my company. I don't subcontract out unless it's a specialty product. Like my standing seam metal, I have a guy that manufactures and installs our panels. But everything else we do in-house, right? And the reason I do that is I want to make sure that we keep quality for our customers. I want to keep continuity with the guys that do the install so that they're getting paid, they make good money. But also, everybody knows what to expect. Everybody knows that there's some comfort in the fact that they know that they're going to get paid every Friday. They're not going to have any issues. If something happens, they know I have their back. We're going to take care of it. All these different things that I think a lot of times these roofing company owners miss is if you don't have great labor and you don't take care of your great labor, then you're going to have a really tough time running your business. And you're always going to be looking for new people. And that's where you run into problems. That's where you let down the customer. That's where you don't get paid. And that's where you go out of business, right? So it's all starts with the estimate, man. Every single bit of it, knowing your numbers, being profitable, and being able to pay everybody so that you can knock it out of the park for the customer. If you don't know your numbers, you can't do it.
And the crew thing is a great point, because I remember I had a good friend. I was a GC in Florida before I went into the SaaS side of the business, right? And we used subcontractors for like the skilled things. We did a lot of interior stuff. Like we had carpenters and everything in house, but like our electrician and our plumber, those guys were subbed out, right? And it was it was probably one of the hardest things to do as a GC was to find subcontractors that you trusted and you could rely on.
Yep.
Right. And it was funny because I had a buddy who was in Georgia and he was a general contractor as well. And he swore by it. Right. So we would constantly get in this argument because he was like, oh no, all of my guys are subs because it keeps my overhead super low and my profits higher because I don't have my own guys. Right. Which I lean more towards what you do. Right. I think that having those guys on staff is huge because they become more loyal, they become more dependable, you can manage the quality better, right? And you're not working around their schedule and working around the fact that they don't show up. And like you said, like it's the quickest way to let a customer down is to say like, yeah, the electrician will be here on this day. And then he calls you 20 minutes before he's supposed to be there and says, oh, no, hung up someplace else because I'm working for 3 other GCs. And that used to happen to us all the time. But now when we were building houses, everybody's contingent on everybody else, right? And that one guy not showing up could set back another subcontractor, which could just snowball into being like a week delay, right? So it was a nightmare dealing with subs at that point. I can totally understand and appreciate the fact of having those inside crews and being able to really manage that.
Yeah, I have my GC license here too. And so we do some stuff like we do some window installs and we do some deck and balcony builds and all that stuff. And this is going to go back to what we were just talking about, it being profitable and understanding your numbers. And the other thing that I did really right was I was very conservative with my money, meaning I took a small paycheck and I put everything else back into the business so that I had some cash available so that when I use a sub or I have to have somebody come in and do something, one of the biggest mistakes that GCs make is they make their subcontractors wait for their money. And if you do that, they're never going to be in any hurry to help you out, right? So what I did was, because I've been on the install side, right? I understand, like, you do your job, you want to get paid, right? So I would go and I would check their work. I would make sure everything's done right. And then I would pay them. I pay them immediately, right? I write them a check as soon as the job's done, even if I haven't been paid. And I do that because if I don't have these guys available, I can't do my work. It's a really simple concept that a lot of people don't get. I mean,
right. No, I completely understand. Yeah. Yeah, that's the truth. Yeah. I mean, I've seen it happen. I worked for a construction company where the guy would do exactly that. He would tell these guys like, yeah, I need you to go over here and fix some sheetrock or something like that. And then, they're coming to the job site asking us for money. And we're like, that's the owner. And then they're like, the owner won't answer his phone. And of course not. He doesn't want to pay you. He's waiting until he gets paid, till he gets a draw so he can pay you. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I totally get that. But I think this parlays really good into like the conversation around company culture, right? Like I think you guys have really nailed it at SouthShore. And I think that one of the things is, like you said, having those internal crews, like bringing those guys in as part of the team rather than them just being subs, I think works towards that, right? Like it definitely is building a bigger team aspect, and I guess early on, like you said, you started hiring people, you got some sales guys in there. At what point did you realize, like, I'm sure I know I ran my own business and you hire people and you're driving to make sales and forget about the people sometimes, right? And it's like you make that mistake early on. And at what point did you realize like, wow, the people are just as, if not more important than the sales and the production part of it?
Yeah. So I've always known that, man, being a former installer, and look, there's no bones about it. Roofing in Florida during the summer sucks. I mean, it's tough, man. And I always looked at it from, hey, man, I need these guys, right? Just me naturally coming up through the ranks and being the new guy and just getting shit on the job site all the time because I'm new. And I always looked at it like, man, I don't want that type of environment, right? I don't want the type of environment where people. Now, we bust balls. I'm not going to say we don't, right? But I don't want the type of environment where there's any type of negativity. And so I also know that I need these installers. I'm going to give you a little secret. How I find my crews is I go out and I look at other roofing crews and watch the job they do and see how they're managed. And I go and talk to the lead guy and ask them if they're happy, right? And I ask them if they're taken care of, if they're making the money that they want to make. And invariably, almost every single one of them says no, right?
Yeah, I believe.
And so now the crews that I have came to me because people talk, right? People in the industry talk,
Sure.
and they're like, "Man, this guy treats us good." I'm about to take one of the crews that I've had the longest. We're going to go do a job over in Orlando, and then I'm taking all 7 of them to Disney World because they've never been, right? So these guys, they bust their ass and they do a job that a lot of people don't want to do. So if you don't take care of them, then it's going to be like pulling teeth to get them to fix something or to show up on time, all those different things. So I knew right away that the people on the team, I can't do this without the other team members. I can't do it.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't have the hubris to act like I'm better than any of them. And so one of the things when you and I were talking about this before we started recording, I was challenged by somebody to write down like the core values of the company, the mission, all of that stuff. And we're 4.5 years in, and I've never done that. And it was extremely challenging. But one of the things that came about was 2 things. One, I realized that since day one, like I've really focused on making the people that I bring in feel a part of the team and really collaborate with them and listen to them to try to make sure that they're given the resources and training so that they can knock it out of the park with their job, right? But the other thing that I realized was like, I will always roll up my sleeves with these guys and girls to make sure that we do things the right way. And if there are issues, nobody points fingers. It's like, hey, how do we stay solution minded here and make sure we solve the issue? And further, that we don't get into this situation again. And I'm in the trenches with them, solving this stuff, dealing with the issues, so they know 100% that I've got their back.
Yeah. And I think that's a huge insight right there, is I think that rather than the accusations, right? Let's just solve this as a team, but more importantly, let's use it as a learning experience, right? Let's educate everybody involved so that we don't have this happen again, right? And I think that's the piece that so often seems to get overlooked, right? Like it's just like, oh crap, we made a mistake, right? Like let's scramble and fix it, but we don't take the time to say like, okay, why did this happen? How do we prevent it from happening next time so that everybody's aware of it, and use it, turn it into an education piece rather than just like you said, pointing a finger or accusing somebody of making a mistake, because we're all going to do it. Anybody that's ever been on a job site's made a mistake, right? Or a bunch of them. I know I have as well. It happens to all of us. But yeah, it's a great point. I guess talk a little bit about how you guys build or maintain that company culture, right? And what is important to you guys from a core value level for your employees.
I think one of the biggest mistakes that people tend to make is there's a big difference between diagnosing and blaming, right? And at the end of the day, I take responsibility for everything that happens in my company, right? I'm the leader, I'm the owner. And so if there's a failure somewhere, I have to look at it from the vantage point of, okay, where did I not set this person up for success? Where are the holes that I need to help fill to make sure that this doesn't happen again? And look, if you as a leader go to somebody, point the finger at them and say, you didn't do your job and this was the result, they're going to feel next time something happens, they're not going to want to bring that up. They're going to try to hide it. They're going to try to minimize it or whatever it is. If you say, hey, listen, here's what happened. Here was the result. What can we do? What can I do to set you up better so that this doesn't happen again? What can I give you? What resources can I give you? Or where can we fill this hole so that as a company, we don't have this happen again? They're going to feel supported. They're going to feel like, okay, I really have somebody that's looking out for my best interest, right? And because they know that I'm looking out for their best interest, and it's a lot of times people think, okay, if you just pay people, they'll feel valued. That's not the case at all, right? What makes people feel valued is you understanding their situation, you putting yourself in their shoes, right? Look, everybody in a construction company has a very difficult job. This is a challenging industry. You got to have thick skin. You can knock it out of the park and you still get terrible asshole customers. And it just happens, right?
Right.
And if you take the tact with them, like, listen, we're in this together. I understand your situation. I empathize with you. I want to make sure that you know that I support you 100% across the board, and you actually behave that way towards them. They feel valued. They feel listened to. When something goes wrong, you say, hey, help me understand this from your perspective. What happened? Right? And then they tell you, and you listen to them, and you say, okay. Now, I'm not always going to agree with them, right? Sometimes they did make a mistake, and it was just their error, and that it happens, right? But I'm going to allow them to tell me how they view it from their perspective so that I can make sure that if there is something that I can do better as the owner or one of my managers can do better, then we're going to do that, right? We're not going to do some knee-jerk reactive stuff where I'm going to put some overreaching policies in place to plug this hole of something that never happens. It's this rarity, right? Which happens also. Okay. No. And the next piece of that is, and I think the final piece of that is we have a status meeting every morning, every Monday morning, right? Where my managers and we sit down and we talk about what's going on. We talk about the good, we talk about the bad, we talk about the we're not really sure. And we use data and we use metrics to really look at what we're talking about, because feelings ain't fact. They're just not, right?
Yeah.
You could feel really great about what's going on and you look at your numbers and you're like, holy crap, that's not really that great.
Yeah.
Right? Or you can feel really bad about something and then you look at the numbers and you're like, this actually isn't so bad. Right? So I think the totality of that is really where you can allow your company and your people to have autonomy. And when you allow them to have autonomy and own their position, you really create a great culture.
Yeah, I like that. One thing that I have found, and one thing that, when I worked for the CRM and I would see all of these guys' workflows, and one of the things that I noticed is, and maybe you can speak to this, I don't know if you John Broche, but John Broche made a comment to me one day. We were talking about people, like we were talking about his people. And he said, yeah, there's going to, when you hire new people, you don't necessarily trust right away that they can do the job. Like they got to prove it and all this stuff. He said, but the one thing that I do so that I don't have to trust the people is that I trust the process. He's like, I build a process that I trust people can be successful in. Right. And I thought it was like probably one of the most one of the greatest comments that anyone's ever made to me is like, he built a process that he 100% believes in, that he's bought into, that he completely trusts to operate. And then he plugs the people in to the process and it makes their life easier, I think, too. Right. Like, I think it's much easier for you to give someone autonomy and for them to run with a spot when you have a process in place that you trust. Right.
Yeah.
What do you think? What's your feeling on that?
If I have one takeaway from this podcast, I think what Jonathan said would be it, right? You have to have a process in place. And this really goes to team culture, because when people feel well-trained and confident, they know what's expected of them, and they have the comfort and confidence to do that, they're going to knock it out of the park with their job, right? I cringe all the time when I hear these company owners and they're just destroying their salespeople, right? And they're like, these guys are awful, they're scumbags, they're this, that, and the other. It's like, okay, you didn't train them at all. You basically acted like a pimp, threw them out on the street, go get me some money and some jobs and bring me back, right? And then when they weren't successful at that, you're like, these guys are terrible. Jonathan hit the nail on the head, man. You got to have a process in place to set people up for success, man. You cannot have a good team culture unless you have that in place. People can make money, you can take them on trips, you can do all of that stuff. But if you don't have a process in place where people can thrive and understand their role, how to do it and be successful, you can forget it. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. And you made a good comment. And it's funny because it actually is the exact same comment that Ty Backer made to me in another podcast is the money is not everything, right? Like at some point, just giving people raises and just paying them better is not going to be enough for them. And so what else do you guys do at South Shore to kind of help promote that company culture and keep these people engaged? Like you said, at some point, the money is not everything. What other things have you guys done there? Training, I think, like you said, educating and training, I think is a big one. But what are some of the other things that you guys have found successful?
So one of our other core values, right, is work-life balance. I don't think a lot of roofing companies really look at the fact that we want hustlers, right, especially on the sales side. The problem with hustlers, and I fell into this myself, is like we will just hustle and grind because we want to make money, we want to be successful. And then all of a sudden you wake up one day and you're burned out, right?
Yeah.
And you're angry, everybody's getting on your nerves, all of the customers are terrible, all your leads suck, you know what I mean? And the other part of developing that culture is like, I'm giving everybody off Labor Day paid. Everybody gets Labor Day paid off, right? Because I want them to go out and enjoy their family. I tell my sales guys, listen, you have autonomy over your calendar, right? You control when you take appointments. One of the other things that I do that people tell me I'm crazy is I don't do weekend or night appointments. I will not schedule a weekend or night appointment for my sales guys. Now, if they want to take them, they can. But I learned early on when I was working for that remodeling company that if it's important to people and people really see value in what you're bringing, they'll make time to meet with you, right? So I really try to understand how my sales team operates and how my admin team operates and how my installers operate. And I try to give them the benefit and value of being able to take time off and being able to make good money without having to kill yourself. I think that's the other part of the team culture, man, is I really believe in work-life balance. I really do. And I give paid holidays off. I let people take off early and I don't clock them out. All of those different things. If my crews need something, I'll either lend them money or I'll give them money. Just things like that really help them see that I support them and I understand their side of things and really make sure that I take care of them.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's a piece that's very overlooked, right? I think we just think of these guys as like, hey, we just need them to get the job done a lot of times. And we forget that they have a life outside of the job, right? And ultimately, hopefully, like I'm sure the whole reason that you started this company was so that you could eventually have a life outside of this job, right? And have some quality of life. I think that's a piece that gets overlooked when we look at employees. I know like at Roofr, that's one of the things that they've done extremely well at is that work-life balance. And they always are continuing to strive to do better for our group there. I applaud them for that. And I applaud you guys for doing the same thing. So what's next for SouthShore Roofing? Like, where do you guys go from here?
I've got everything running pretty well on the residential side, right? So what's next for us is I think we've got things dialed in pretty well on the residential side. We went from 1.5 million to we'll probably do about 10 million this year, all retail. And I, for some reason, because I'm a glutton for punishment, have decided that I want to really develop the commercial side. So I had a meeting with a guy on Monday who actually sold his own business, guy I went to high school with. He understands the commercial side really well. He's been in commercial construction for a long time. So he and I are trying to work out a deal to bring him on so that we can really develop the maintenance and the repair side for commercial and really develop that. So I'm thinking about 2023. That's going to be a heavy focus of mine to get the maintenance and service side on the commercial end going.
Nice. One thing I wanted to ask you is early on when you started, I think one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of roofing companies make, and it's funny, it came up in the last podcast I did with Luke from Company Cam, is because one of the things that I applaud Company Cam for as a company is the fact that they've stayed so hyper focused on just their little piece, right? And they've just become fantastic at it. But I think early on, you did the same thing, right? Like, I think that you didn't really diversify. You just were a roofer, right? Like, you didn't really take on a lot of other stuff. And I think that's a trap that's so easy to fall into, because it's like, oh, I really need to get my windows replaced. Well, we're here, we could do that, right? Like, and I think we start to take on too many things. Like, I know I worked with one company that essentially, it was a roofing company, but they had guys on staff that would do drywall work. If the roof leaked, they would send somebody inside. And I was like, you guys are spread all over the place, right?
Yes.
And so I think, speak a little bit to that. Like, what made you make the decision to just stay, like, let's stay hyper focused, like even the retail model, right? Like, you stayed with retail. You didn't try to go too much too early, right? And be an insurance guy, be a retail guy, and all spread yourself out, or take on all those other things. It sounds like now you guys have kind of diversified into some of that other stuff. How long did you guys wait before you started to do that?
2 years. 2 years. I waited 2 years. And Florida's unique because it's not unique. Florida you have to have specific licensing for things, right? You have to have your GC license. You have to have your electrician's license. You have to have your specific roofing license, all that stuff. And I'm going to give you a really long-winded answer to that question, okay? So bear with me. I used to get really annoyed because I've been in the industry for so long. I used to get really annoyed at what was happening in the roofing industry, mainly through social media, right? I'm looking at a lot of these new people that are coming in and they're telling people how to run their businesses, and they're telling people how to do sales, and they're telling people to do X, Y, and Z and diversify and basically make sure you have all these streams of income and all this stuff. And I used to just blast people out in these groups and call out these coaches and all this stuff. And the result was I was just angry and I didn't listen to anybody, right? And so Mike Stearns from day one has been really instrumental in helping me grow my business. And he had met Dave Carroll, who I have an extreme amount of respect for, because what he's done with his business has been amazing.
Incredible.
It's really helped. It's really helped me in my business. And they met at a conference one day and my name came up, and and we don't know each other, Dave and I. And he said to Mike, he's like, yeah, that dude's really angry. Right. And Mike told me about it, and I was like, holy shit, man, that's how people see me. And so I reached out to Dave and I said, you know what, man, I really appreciate you saying that, even though we don't know each other, because it really helped me realize how people viewed me and really the vantage point I was taking in terms of listening to other people. Right. So I said, I got to stop that. I need to be open-minded and I need to listen to some of these people, because even if they're new, they might have something of value for me, so that I can hear. Turns out I was listening to a podcast one day, and one of the guys was talking about sticking to our core competencies, right? And what does that look like? And even though most of what he was saying I didn't agree with, he did talk about people make the mistake of thinking that sticking to your core competencies is just sticking to one thing, right? And I was like, man, I know siding really well. I know home services really well because I came from the remodeling space. I know roofing really well. So I think I can set things up to diversify the work that we do, but still stick to my core competencies, right? And so I thought about that and I kind of mapped it out. And now we do quite a bit of siding now, actually. And this year we've become a preferred installer through James Hardy and got those designations and accreditations and all those different things. And so my point is that I agree with Company Cam, which is an amazing piece of technology. I'm so glad that they do it. Roofr is an amazing piece of technology, right? And I've been with Roofr since day one. I've used every product that Roofr's had, man. Roofr can kind of speak to kind of sticking to your core competencies and the learning and the growth and all that stuff. And so anyway, point being, year 2, I decided to start taking on some additional work, and there's been some bumps and bruises along the way, but I'm sticking to my core competencies, which is exteriors. Right? I've decided we focus on exteriors. We do roofing, siding, windows. That's it. right? Because I've taken on some jobs and I've lost my ass on them, right? Even though I know how to do them, right? I didn't have the team members in place and all that different stuff. And what I can say about this is be open-minded, listen to everyone, understand that you're not going to agree with them, understand that, that there are people that are new to the industry that are going to have some valuable things to say. And it's up to me to not be that grumpy, stubborn know-it-all, right? To not listen and maybe consider some of the things that other people in the industry have said. And so that's really changed. That really changed the trajectory of the company, and it really changed the trajectory of my mindset when it comes into relation of like listening to people and considering what people have to say. And I think more importantly, what I've done is tried to help and tried to maybe give people a different perspective instead of being an asshole and blast people, right? Yeah. So that, I know that was a long-winded question or answer to the question.
Good. That's a good answer.
Yeah.
No, it definitely was a great answer to that question. Man, I really appreciate you coming on. A lot of great insight, a great story there. And thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for asking me, Pete, man. This was great. I'm glad we finally got to do this. I know we've been kicking it around for a while, but yeah, it's really great, man. I appreciate it.
Cool. All right, man. Thanks. Hopefully everybody got some really great stuff out of that. And we will see you next time on the Roofr Podcast.